Detective Sarah Chen pressed her fingers against the squad car's window, watching the morning mist rise from what remained of Millbrook Lake. The drought had been merciless. 7 years of sparse rainfall had transformed the community's heart into a moonscape of cracked mud and exposed secrets. Where families once brought their children to swim, now only puddles remained, connected by streams barely deep enough for minnows. "Hell of a thing," Sheriff Morrison muttered, crushing his cigarette under his boot. At 68, he'd lived through the town's golden years and its slow decline, but nothing had prepared him for this revelation emerging from the receding waters. The boat sat like an accusation in the morning light, a 17-foot aluminum fishing boat, its hull streaked with rust and lake sediment. But it was the boat's position that made Sarah's detective instincts prickle. Not in the deep center where the current might have carried wreckage, but tucked against what had once been the northwestern shore, partially concealed by a cluster of submerged boulders that formed a natural alcove. "That's Tommy Brennan's boat," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades. "Been missing since October 15th, 2001. Him and his nephew Danny went out for their usual morning fishing trip, never came back." Sarah studied the scene with fresh eyes. The boat's anchor was deployed, its chain taut and purposeful. Someone had intentionally positioned this vessel, someone who knew the lake's geography intimately enough to hide it from casual view. "Tell me about Tommy Brennan." Morrison's weathered face softened with memory. "Good man. Tough life, though. Lost his wife to cancer in '92. Then his sister Mary, Danny's mum, in 99. Same disease, can you believe that? Tommy took Danny in without question. Kid was 9 years old, lost and broken. But Tommy made that boy laugh again. Any problems? Complaints? Domestic calls?" "Nothing official." Morrison's hesitation was telling. "Look, Sarah, Tommy was respected here. Owned the tackle shop downtown. Knew every fish in this lake. Taught half the town's kids how to cast a line. If he had troubles, he kept them private." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already working. Men who kept troubles private often let them fester until they exploded in ways that destroyed everything they'd tried to protect. October 14th, 2001, 11:47 p.m. Tommy Brennan sat at his kitchen table, a bottle of prescription pills rolling between his palms like dice. The house was silent except for the soft sounds of Danny sleeping upstairs, the boy's breathing punctuated by occasional murmurs from dreams that Tommy prayed were peaceful. The episodes were getting worse. This morning he'd found himself standing in Danny's room with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His hands clenched into fists, rage coursing through his veins like poison. Danny had been sleeping, vulnerable and trusting, and for one terrible moment Tommy had felt the urge to. He'd fled to the bathroom and vomited until his stomach was empty, then spent an hour scrubbing his hands, as if he could wash away the darkness growing inside his mind. Dr. Hendricks had been clear about the diagnosis: early onset Alzheimer's with aggressive behavioral manifestations. The technical term couldn't capture the horror of it, the way his own mind was becoming his enemy, the way decades of memories were dissolving like sugar in rain, leaving behind only fragments of violence and confusion. "The medication might help with the aggressive episodes," Hendricks had said, sliding the prescription across his desk. "But Tommy, you need to consider your nephew's safety. These behavioral changes, they're unpredictable." Tommy had wanted to argue, to insist that he'd never hurt Danny, that the boy was the only light left in his darkening world. But then he'd remembered finding Danny's hamster 3 days ago. Its tiny neck twisted, blood under his own fingernails, and 4 hours of his life simply gone. The pills rattled in their bottle, 30 tablets of lorazepam, enough to quiet the storm in his head permanently. He'd researched the dosage carefully, methodically, the way he approached everything important. Enough to stop the episodes forever. Enough to ensure Danny would never have to see his uncle become the monster lurking in his deteriorating mind. The insurance policy would pay out. Accidental death during a fishing trip was believable, tragic, but not suspicious. Danny would go to his Aunt Carol in Denver, get a fresh start away from this dying town, and the memories of everyone he'd lost. The boy was smart, resilient. He'd build a good life with the insurance money funding his education. Tommy opened the bottle and counted out the pills, arranging them in neat rows on the table. Tomorrow morning, he'd take Danny fishing one last time. They'd have a perfect day on the water, uncle and nephew sharing stories and laughter. Then, when Danny was distracted by his line, Tommy would take the pills and slip quietly into the lake's embrace. It would look like an accident, an older man having a heart attack while fishing, falling overboard while his nephew tried desperately to save him. Danny would blame himself for not being strong enough to pull his uncle from the water, but guilt was easier to survive than the truth. The boy would never have to know that his uncle's mind was rotting from the inside out, never have to see the violence that lurked in the spaces between memories. Tommy swept the pills back into the bottle and climbed the stairs to check on Danny one last time. The boy slept peacefully, his face relaxed and innocent, one arm hanging over the edge of the bed. At 12, he still had the trust of childhood, still believed that the adults in his life would protect him from harm. Tomorrow, Tommy would make sure that trust wasn't misplaced. Present day. Millbrook Lake crime scene. Sarah Chen waded through the ankle-deep water toward the boat, her boots sinking into decades of accumulated silt. Each step released bubbles and the smell of stagnant vegetation, but she pressed forward, drawn by details that didn't fit the narrative of accidental drowning. The boat's interior was a time capsule. 2 fishing rods remained secured in their holders, lines still attached, but long since deteriorated. A red Coleman cooler sat wedged under the stern seat, its lid latched tight. Most telling of all were the life jackets, one adult orange vest draped over the bow seat, one child-sized blue vest folded neatly beside it, both bone dry, despite 23 years underwater. They never went in the water. Sarah called to Morrison, who was photographing the scene from shore. These life jackets were placed, not discarded. She found the scratches carved into the aluminum hull near the bow, letters etched deep enough to survive decades of submersion. TOMMY in careful block letters, and below it, in the unsteady hand of a child, DANNY WASHERE. Morrison sloshed through the water to join her, his face pale as he studied the inscription. Jesus, Sarah, they were here. They were alive when this boat ended up in the shallows. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The missing persons report had triggered a massive search effort. Helicopters, dive teams, volunteers dragging the deeper parts of the lake for bodies that were never found. But no one had thought to search the shallows near the shore, where the water was clear enough to see the bottom. I need everything on the Brennan case, she said. Police reports, medical records, insurance claims, and I want to talk to everyone who knew Tommy personally. Sarah, I'm telling you, Tommy Brennan wasn't the type to... To what? Fake his death? Kill his nephew? Or maybe save his nephew from something worse? Sarah studied Morrison's face. You knew him better than anyone. What aren't you telling me? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, watching the crime scene technicians document the boat. There were rumors, he finally said. Nothing concrete, nothing we could act on. But in the months before they disappeared, neighbors called a few times about shouting coming from the Brennan house. Loud voices, things breaking. When we'd show up, Danny would answer the door with that big smile of his, say everything was fine. Did you believe him? Kids protect their abusers even when they shouldn't. We all know that. Morrison's voice was heavy with regret. But Danny seemed genuinely happy, talked about his uncle constantly, fishing trips, baseball games, how Tommy was teaching him to drive the boat. If there was abuse happening, that kid was either the best actor I'd ever seen, or what? Or something else was going on, something we didn't understand. The breakthrough came not from official records, but from a conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Voss, who had lived next door to the Brennans for 37 years. At 84, her memory was sharp as winter air, and her observations had the precision of someone who'd spent decades watching her neighbors' lives unfold. Tommy was struggling, she said, serving Sarah tea in china cups that belonged to another era. Not with drinking or gambling, or any of the usual demons men wrestle with, something deeper, something that scared him. Mrs. Voss's living room overlooked the Brennan house, now occupied by a young family who'd bought it at auction after Tommy and Danny were declared legally dead. But in her mind, Sarah could see it as it had been, a modest 2-story home with a well-tended garden and a workshop where Tommy repaired fishing equipment for half the town. I heard the shouting you mentioned, but it wasn't what people thought. What do you mean? I heard Tommy yelling, yes, but he wasn't yelling at Danny. He was yelling at himself, cursing, crying sometimes, like he was fighting with someone we couldn't see. Mrs. Voss set down her teacup with trembling hands. One morning in September, I found him in my garden at dawn, just standing there in his pajamas, looking confused. When I asked what he was doing, he couldn't remember leaving his house. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. Did he see a doctor? Dr. Hendricks down at the clinic. Tommy was private about it, but I saw him coming and going for appointments. Whatever they told him, it frightened him, more than anything I'd ever seen. Mrs. Voss walked to her window and pointed toward the lake, barely visible through the trees. The morning they disappeared, I watched them load the boat. Tommy moved like a man carrying the weight of the world, but Danny was excited, chattering about some new lure he wanted to try. They hugged before getting in the truck, a long hug, like Tommy was memorizing it. Did you see them come back? No, but I saw lights in the house that night, just for a few minutes, moving around like someone with a flashlight. Sarah leaned forward. You never reported this? Who was I going to tell? That I maybe saw lights in a house where 2 people had supposedly drowned. The search teams were dragging the lake. Everyone was looking for bodies. Besides, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Grief does things to your mind. But Mrs. Voss hadn't imagined it. Sarah was certain. Someone had returned to the Brennan house after the boat was discovered missing. Someone who needed something important enough to risk exposure. The medical records confirmed Sarah's growing suspicions. Dr. Hendricks had retired years earlier, but his files painted a heartbreaking picture of Tommy Brennan's final months. The diagnosis was brutal in its simplicity. Early onset Alzheimer's disease, with aggressive behavioral episodes, progressing rapidly despite medication. The appointment notes were clinically precise but emotionally devastating. Tommy had described violent urges that came without warning, periods of lost time, where he'd find evidence of destructive behavior he couldn't remember. He'd begged Dr. Hendricks for stronger medication, anything that might control the episodes before he hurt someone he loved. Patient exhibits extreme anxiety about nephew's safety, one note read. States he would rather die than harm the child. Discussed residential care options, but patient becomes agitated at suggestion of separation from nephew. The final appointment was dated October 12th, 3 days before the disappearance. Tommy had requested information about lethal dosages of his prescribed medications, ostensibly for a research project about pharmaceutical safety. Dr. Hendricks had refused to provide the information, but noted his concern about suicidal ideation. Sarah found the insurance investigation file buried in the county clerk's archives. The payout had been delayed for 2 years, while investigators tried to determine whether the deaths were accidental or intentional. The final report concluded that, while the circumstances were unusual, there was no evidence of foul play or suicide. The insurance company had paid out $750,000, enough to fund a comfortable life for a boy who would never claim it. But someone had claimed it, Sarah realized. The policy had been paid to a trust established for Danny's benefit, managed by Tommy's attorney, with instructions to transfer funds to the boy's legal guardian. The guardian listed in the trust documents was Carol Brennan Morrison, Tommy's sister-in-law, who lived in Denver. Sarah made the call that would change everything. Carol Morrison, this is Detective Chen with the Millbrook Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about your nephew, Danny Brennan. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the connection had been lost. I've been expecting this call for 23 years, Carol finally said. October 15th, 2001, 5:47 a.m. Danny Brennan woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of his uncle humming in the kitchen, the same off-key melody Tommy always hummed when he was nervous or trying to concentrate. The boy dressed quickly in his fishing clothes, old jeans with grass stains on the knees, a sweatshirt that had once belonged to his father, sneakers that squeaked when they got wet. He found Tommy at the stove, flipping bacon with mechanical precision. The kitchen table was set for 2, but Tommy's plate remained empty, while Danny's was piled high, with eggs, bacon, and toast, cut into triangles the way his mum used to make it. Big breakfast for a fishing trip, Danny observed, settling into his chair. Growing boy needs fuel, Tommy replied, but his voice carried a forced cheerfulness that made Danny's stomach tighten with worry. His uncle had been different lately, distracted, sad in a way that went deeper than normal grief. Danny had heard him crying in his room some nights, and once he'd found Tommy standing in the hallway at 3 a.m, staring at nothing with confusion written across his face. Uncle Tommy, are you okay? Tommy turned from the stove, and Danny saw tears in his eyes, tears his uncle quickly wiped away with the back of his hand. I'm fine, kiddo. Just thinking about your mom, how much she loved watching us fish together. Danny nodded, but he wasn't convinced. Something was wrong, something his uncle wasn't telling him. Adults always thought they were protecting kids by hiding the truth, but Danny had learned to read the signs, the way Tommy sometimes forgot things he'd said 5 minutes earlier, the way he'd find him standing in rooms with no memory of why he'd gone there, the prescription bottles that appeared and disappeared from the medicine cabinet. Are we really going fishing, or is this about something else? Tommy sat down across from him, his untouched coffee growing cold. What makes you ask that? You haven't eaten anything. You keep looking at me like you're trying to memorize my face. And you hugged me 3 times yesterday for no reason. Danny pushed eggs around his plate. Plus, Mrs. Voss told me she saw you in her garden the other morning, in your pajamas. She was worried about you. Tommy was quiet for a long time, his hands folded on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Danny, what would you do if you found out someone you loved was sick, really sick, in a way that might make them dangerous? I'd try to help them get better. And if they couldn't get better, if the sickness was only going to get worse? Danny set down his fork, his 12-year-old mind grappling with concepts that felt too large and terrible to fully comprehend. Then I'd stay with them anyway, because that's what family does. Tommy's face crumpled, and he reached across the table to take Danny's hand. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. You know that? After your mum died, I thought my heart was broken beyond repair. But you made me remember what love feels like. Uncle Tommy, you're scaring me. I'm sorry, I don't mean to. Tommy squeezed his hand. Let's go fishing. We'll take the boat out to your favorite spot. Try those new lures you've been wanting to use. Maybe we'll catch something worth bragging about. They loaded the truck with their gear, rods, tackle box, cooler packed with sandwiches and soda, life jackets that Tommy insisted they bring even though Danny was a strong swimmer. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect October day that made you believe autumn might last forever. At the boat launch, Tommy worked with unusual care, checking and rechecking the motor, the anchor, the safety equipment. Other fishermen called out greetings, and Tommy waved back with forced enthusiasm, but Danny noticed how his uncle's hands shook as he untied the mooring lines. They motored out to the northwestern section of the lake, where a cluster of submerged rocks created a natural haven for smallmouth bass. It was Danny's favorite fishing spot, a place where he'd caught his first keeper 2 summers earlier. Tommy navigated between the rocks with practiced skill, dropping anchor in the perfect position to cast into the deeper water beyond. For the first hour they fished in comfortable silence, their lines cutting parallel paths through the morning still water. Danny caught 2 small bass and threw them back, while Tommy's rod remained motionless in its holder. His uncle sat staring at the water with an intensity that had nothing to do with fishing. Uncle Tommy, yeah, kiddo. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it together. You don't have to carry it alone. Tommy's laugh was bitter and broken. Some things can't be fixed, Danny. Some problems don't have solutions that good people can live with. Danny reeled in his line and set his rod aside, giving his uncle his complete attention. Try me. Tommy reached into his tackle box and pulled out a small plastic bottle, the kind that held prescription medication. He shook it gently, and Danny could hear pills rattling inside. I'm sick, Tommy said simply. My brain is sick, and it's getting worse. Sometimes I do things I don't remember doing. Sometimes I feel angry for no reason, angry enough to hurt someone. And lately, he paused, his voice breaking. Lately, those episodes are happening more often. Danny felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach. What kind of episodes? I found your hamster dead 3 days ago. Its neck was broken, and there was blood under my fingernails. I don't remember doing it, but I must have, because no one else was in the house. Danny stared at his uncle, trying to process information that felt impossible to accept. Tommy, who had taught him to be gentle with all living things, who refused to kill spiders because they had as much right to exist as anyone else, had killed Whiskers during some kind of blackout. The doctor says it's going to get worse, Tommy continued. The violent episodes, the memory loss, all of it. Eventually I won't remember who you are. I might hurt you during one of my episodes, and I wouldn't even know I'd done it. So you take medication, you get treatment, we figure it out. The medication isn't working well enough, and there are no guarantees it ever will. Tommy held up the bottle of pills. These are different. These would make sure I never hurt anyone again. Danny understood then, the full, terrible weight of what his uncle was planning. The fishing trip wasn't just a fishing trip. It was a goodbye. Tommy intended to take those pills and slip beneath the lake's surface, making his death look like an accident, so Danny wouldn't have to live with the knowledge that his uncle had chosen to leave him. No, Danny said firmly. Danny, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. You think the only way to protect me is to kill yourself and make me spend the rest of my life believing it was my fault for not saving you. Tommy's face went pale. It wouldn't be your fault. You're just a kid. Exactly. I'm just a kid, which means I'm going to blame myself no matter what story you tell. I'm going to wonder if I said something wrong, if I could have tried harder to pull you out of the water, if I could have prevented it somehow. Danny's voice rose with emotion. You want to protect me? Then don't make me live with that guilt. But if I don't, then we disappear together. Tommy stared at his nephew, startled by the simplicity and audacity of the suggestion. What? We fake our deaths, make it look like we both drowned, then start over somewhere else. Use the insurance money to get you real treatment, the kind that actually works. Find doctors who specialize in whatever's wrong with you. Danny, that's impossible. It's fraud. It's better than suicide. Danny leaned forward, his young face set with determination that reminded Tommy painfully of his sister Mary. Uncle Tommy, you saved me when Mom died. You gave me a home and a family when I had nothing. Now it's my turn to save you. Tommy felt something inside his chest. Hope, terrible and fragile as spun glass. Even if we could pull it off, you'd have to give up everything. Your friends, your school, your whole life. You'd have to lie about who you are for years, maybe forever. I don't care about any of that. Danny's voice was steady, certain. The only thing I care about is keeping you alive long enough to get better. Everything else is just details. Tommy looked at the bottle of pills in his hand, then at his nephew's face. 12 years old and willing to sacrifice his entire existence to save an uncle whose mind was betraying him. The boy's courage was humbling and heartbreaking in equal measure. How would we even begin to... The boat, Danny said immediately. We anchor it in the shallows, where it'll be found, but not too quickly. Leave our life jackets inside to make it look like we tried to swim for shore, but didn't make it. The current will carry our bodies downstream, and when they're never found, everyone will assume they were washed out to the river. Tommy marveled at the boy's quick thinking. And then what? We just disappear into thin air. We hike out through the back country to where you stash supplies. You did stash supplies, didn't you? I saw you loading camping gear into the truck yesterday. Tommy had indeed loaded camping gear, but it had been intended as props to sell the story of an accidental drowning during a fishing trip. Now, looking at his nephew's determined face, he began to see how those same supplies could serve a very different purpose. Danny, this is crazy. We'd be fugitives. We'd have to live our entire lives looking over our shoulders. Better than not living at all. Danny reached across the boat and took the pill bottle from his uncle's hand. Without hesitation, he unscrewed the cap and poured the contents into the lake, watching the white tablets sink beneath the surface. There. Now you have to choose a different solution. Tommy watched the pills disappear and felt something shift inside him, the terrible weight of his planned suicide lifting, replaced by a different kind of fear. Fear of the unknown, of the massive deception they were contemplating, of the possibility that they might actually pull it off. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll never be Danny Brennan again." "I stopped being Danny Brennan the day Mom died," the boy replied. "You gave me a second chance at life then. Now I'm giving you one." Tommy looked at the lake, at the boat, at the nephew who was willing to disappear from the world to save him. In that moment, he made a choice that would define the rest of both their lives. "Okay," he said quietly, "let's disappear." Present-day Denver, Colorado. The house was modest but well-maintained, with a small garden and a workshop visible behind the main structure. Sarah sat in her rental car for several minutes, studying the address Carol Morrison had provided, knowing that whatever happened next would fundamentally change her understanding of the Brennan case. Carol Morrison answered the door. Before Sarah could knock, a woman in her 60s, with graying hair and eyes that held secrets. She led Sarah to a living room filled with photographs, most of them featuring the same two subjects across different ages and settings. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 23 years, Carol said, settling into an armchair. "When Danny called to tell me about the drought and the boat being discovered, I knew it was only a matter of time." Sarah studied the photographs on the mantel, images of Tommy and Danny at various ages, but taken years after their supposed deaths. In one, Tommy appeared to be in his late 50s, his arm around a teenage Danny at what looked like a high school graduation. In another, both men were older, standing beside a younger woman in a wedding dress. "They're alive," Sarah said. "Tommy was alive. He passed last winter. Natural causes, peacefully, in a hospital bed surrounded by people who loved him. Danny is very much alive and has been expecting you to find him." Carol walked to a desk and retrieved a manila folder thick with documents. Tommy left instructions for what to do when this day came. He always knew the truth would surface eventually. He used to say that secrets were like bodies in a lake. They always float to the surface eventually. The folder contained photographs, medical records, and a handwritten letter addressed to whoever finds our boat. Sarah opened the letter and began to read Tommy's account of that October morning in 2001. The planned suicide, Danny's intervention, their desperate decision to fake their deaths and start over. "The boy saved his life," Carol continued. "Not just that day, but every day afterward. Tommy got the treatment he needed, found medications that controlled the episodes. He lived 18 more years because a 12-year-old child refused to let him give up." "Where is Danny now?" "Montana. He went back last year, after Tommy died. Bought a small place outside Missoula under his legal name, Daniel Thomas Morrison. He's been preparing for this conversation ever since the drought started." Sarah looked up from the letter. "Morrison? I legally adopted Danny in 2002, gave him a new identity and a clean slate. The insurance money funded Tommy's medical care and Danny's education. He graduated from college, got married, built a good life, but he always knew he'd have to face the consequences eventually." The implications were staggering. "Carol, we're talking about insurance fraud, falsifying death certificates, identity theft. We're talking about a child who chose love over law, who sacrificed his entire identity to save the man who raised him." Carol's voice was firm. "Danny never hurt anyone. He never stole anything that wasn't rightfully his as Tommy's heir. He simply chose to keep his uncle alive long enough for medical science to help him. Sarah spent the next hour reviewing the documentation Carol provided, medical records showing Tommy's successful treatment, educational transcripts for Danny under his new identity, employment records showing steady work and tax payments. It was the most thoroughly documented disappearance she'd ever encountered, maintained with meticulous care by people who had always known they might need to justify their choices. "I need to speak with Danny," Sarah said finally. Carol handed her a slip of paper with an address and phone number. "He's expecting you. Detective, before you go, you should know that Danny has never once expressed regret about his choice, even knowing what it cost him, even facing the possibility of prosecution. He says he'd do it again without hesitation." Sarah pocketed the information and stood to leave, her mind already working through the legal and ethical complexities of the case. At the door, she turned back to Carol. "The night they disappeared, Mrs. Voss saw lights in the Brennan house. What were they doing there?" Carol smiled sadly. "Getting Tommy's medical records and photographs of Danny's parents. When you're about to become someone else, you want to hold onto the pieces of yourself that matter most." October 15th, 2001, 11:30 p.m. The house felt like a mausoleum as Tommy and Danny moved through it one final time, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the familiar darkness. They had returned on foot, hiking 5 miles through forest trails to avoid the roads where search parties might spot them. The official story was holding. 2 fishermen drowned in a tragic accident, their bodies swept away by the lake's current. Danny packed light, a few photographs of his parents, his father's watch, a journal he'd kept since his mother's death. Everything else, his books, his baseball cards, the bedroom where he'd lived for 2 years, would become artifacts of a boy who no longer existed. Tommy gathered his medical records, insurance documents, and cash he'd been slowly withdrawing from his accounts over the past month. In his bedroom, he stood for a long moment looking at photographs of his wife, his sister, and Danny at various ages. He selected a few pictures and left the rest, knowing that taking too many would risk drawing attention to their survival. "You sure about this?" Tommy asked as they prepared to leave. "Last chance to change your mind." Danny looked around the house that had been his sanctuary after his mother's death, the place where his uncle had helped him remember how to smile again. "I'm sure. This house was never really home anyway. You are—" They slipped out through the back door and disappeared into the forest, 2 ghosts carrying everything that mattered toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the empty house held its secrets and waited for the world to declare its inhabitants officially dead. The hike to their rendezvous point took 3 hours, a remote cabin owned by one of Tommy's fishing clients, who used it only during hunting season. Tommy had scouted the location weeks earlier, knowing he'd need somewhere to stage his final act. Now it would serve as their temporary base while they planned their next move. Danny built a small fire while Tommy studied road maps and made plans. They would head north into Canada, then west to British Columbia, where Tommy had heard of experimental treatments for early-onset dementia. The insurance money would follow them through a complex series of trusts and accounts Carol had helped establish, providing the resources they'd need to build new lives. "What will we call ourselves?" Danny asked, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "I was thinking Thomas Morrison and Daniel Morrison, father and son, starting over after losing everything in a house fire. Morrison was Mom's maiden name. Seemed fitting. We're keeping the parts of ourselves that matter most, Our relationship, our love for each other. Everything else is just paperwork." Danny nodded, understanding the significance of carrying his mother's name into their new life. "Do you think we'll ever be able to come back?" "Maybe someday, when the statute of limitations runs out, when the world has forgotten about Tommy and Danny Brennan. But that's a long time from now, kiddo. You might be a grown man with children of your own before it's safe to return." "I don't care about returning," Danny said firmly. "I care about moving forward, together." Tommy looked at his nephew, brave, loyal, willing to sacrifice everything for love, and felt a familiar surge of fierce protectiveness. The boy deserved better than a life lived in shadows, but he'd chosen this path with full knowledge of its costs. The least Tommy could do was make sure it led somewhere worth going. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "We'll move forward together, and we'll build something beautiful from the ashes of who we used to be." Outside, the October wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of distant smoke and the promise of winter. Inside the cabin, two people who had chosen love over law planned their escape from a world that would never understand the depth of their devotion to each other. By morning, they would be different people entirely, but the bond between them, forged in loss, tempered by sacrifice, and strengthened by absolute trust, would remain unchanged. It was the one thing they would never have to leave behind. Present-day Missoula, Montana. Daniel Thomas Morrison opened the door before Sarah could knock, as if he'd been watching for her arrival. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced impossible choices and found peace with their consequences. His eyes were the same bright blue Sarah had seen in the decades-old photographs, but they held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond his years. "Detective Chen," he said, extending his hand. "I've been expecting you." The house was small but comfortable, filled with evidence of a life well lived. Books, fishing equipment, photographs of Danny with a woman who was clearly his wife, and in a place of honor on the mantel, a picture of him with Tommy, he had taken just months before the older man's death. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah began, then stopped. "What do you prefer to be called?" "Danny's fine. That's still who I am, even if it's not who I'm supposed to be." He gestured for her to sit on a comfortable couch, facing a large window that looked out over Montana's mountains. "Can I get you coffee? This conversation is going to take a while." As Danny prepared coffee in the kitchen, Sarah studied the photographs more closely. They told the story of 23 years of life lived in the margins, graduations, birthdays, holidays, all celebrated by people who officially didn't exist. In the most recent photos, Tommy appeared frail but happy, surrounded by what looked like an extended family of friends who had accepted his new identity without question. "He was proud of you," Sarah said, when Danny returned with 2 mugs. "I was proud of him. It took incredible courage to choose treatment over suicide, to fight for recovery even when the odds were against him." Danny settled into a chair across from her. "The first few years were hell, the medication adjustments, the behavioral therapy, learning to manage a condition that wanted to steal everything he was. But he never gave up, and gradually he got better." "Tell me about the boat." Danny smiled at the memory. "We spent 2 hours positioning it perfectly. Had to make it look like we'd tried to swim for shore, but didn't make it. Uncle Tommy knew every rock and current in that lake. He chose a spot where the boat would be hidden, but eventually found, where the story would make sense to investigators." "And you hiked out through the forest?" 5 miles to a cabin, then another 20 miles to where we'd stashed a truck. Uncle Tommy had been planning this for weeks, but as a suicide, not an escape. I just convinced him to use the same preparations for a different ending. Sarah sipped her